Welcome back to Journey. We are on week 16, and this week we're talking about Hosea and Micah. This happens in a time period of the king of Hezekiah and some of the other kings, but Hezekiah does something that is for me one of my favorite Old Testament stories. And so just as a way of beginning this week, I'd like to start with this story with Hezekiah. He was going to be under attack by a foreign king, Sennacherib, and he had written him a letter saying, "I'm coming and you're going down." And Hezekiah goes into the temple and he takes the letter and he spreads it before the Lord and he prays. And God resolves the issue by creating a conflict for Sennacherib in another region of the country. And so Sennacherib has to take his army and go elsewhere. And so Israel is spared at that point. But I love this image that Hezekiah takes this letter, or the problem, the issue, and he takes it into the temple of the Lord, and he just spreads it out before the Lord. And that's an image of prayer there. And for me, it's just served as a reminder that in my life, when I'm facing difficulties or I have more questions than I have answers, which happens to me more often than not, is I can take it and I can spread it out before the Lord, and I can ask Him to make sense of what it is that I need to do, my next step of obedience, or what I need, how I need to respond, and whether I need to wait. And so it really is a picture for me of what prayer looks like, that we just go in and we spread out our needs, our requests before the Lord. And so that happens in this time period. I'd like to begin, since we're covering two prophets today, that we're in the minor prophets, I'd like to start in Micah. And I'd like to go right to our representative passage, which is Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Allow me to just begin reading, and we'll come up and talk about some of the implications as we go. Verse 1, "Listen to what the Lord says. Stand up, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear what you have to say." And so, what do we have here? Stand up, plead your case. This is a courtroom scene. And that's significant, as we're going to find out, because the Lord, throughout the book of Micah, is bringing charges against Israel and Judah. And so these are a people that are refusing to live in the way that God would desire them to live. That they were the covenant people of God. They were God's people, and they were to live that way, and they were not. As a matter of fact, in chapter 3, the description is that they love evil and they hate good. And so they had flipped on its head God's desire. And so God is coming and He's saying, plead your case before me. And here's what He goes on to say. Verse 2, "Hear, O mountains, the Lord's accusations." So God is bringing accusations. He's brought accusations against Israel and Judah. "Listen, you everlasting foundations of the earth, for the Lord has a case against His people. He is lodging a charge against Israel." Verse 3, "My people, what have I done to you? How have I burdened you? Answer me. I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you, also Aaron and Miriam." So here He's providing them with their charges using their historical situation, where God had taken them. And so He begins by saying, don't you remember that I'm the God who brought you up out of Egypt, that I freed you from slavery, that I brought you to the mountain where you would experience my person and my presence, that I would provide for you my law, that I would make you my people, that I would stamp on you the covenant. And so he's beginning by retelling history. My people, remember what Balak, king of Moab, counseled and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered. Now, we didn't get to this story in our study through the Old Testament, but Balak had asked Balaam, who was kind of a prophesier, and so the things that he said came true. God used him in that way. And so Balak asked Balaam to come and to curse God's people. And Balaam said, I don't think this is a good idea, because I can only say what God tells me to say. I can only say what God asks me to say. And Balak says, well, come anyways. And as the story goes, Balaam does go. Even though he tells Balak, I'm only going to be able to say what God tells me to say. So if God asks me to bless this people, which I'm pretty sure he will, that's what I'm going to have to do. And sure enough, Balaam comes and he blesses the people of God. He blesses Israel. Time and time again. And Balak says, why are you doing this? And Balaam says, I told you, I could only say what God asks me to say. And so God is referring back to this time in history when Balaam blessed them, when the people around them were asking him to curse them. And so just how God had protected them, how God had blessed them in the midst of all of their enemies around them. Remember your journey from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. Remember your journey. Remember how I provided for you along the way so that you could be in the promised land, so that you could be my people. Remember, remember, remember. Do you hear it? God is bringing the case against them by telling them their history that they have. Verse 6. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? It's a good question. Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? So there's an important question that's being asked here is, how do I honor the Lord? Is it with sacrifice? And that's what each of these are. Is it the sacrifice of a lamb? Is it a whole bunch of rams? Is it my own flesh and blood? Is it my firstborn? And then verse 8. He has showed you, O man, what is good. This says no. No, the sacrifices is not what I desire. That's what God's saying, is that I don't desire sacrifice. What does he desire then? What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This is what God was desiring to tell Israel through the prophet of Micah, is that God desires for us to be a people who are desirous for all people to experience God's goodness. That's what it means to live justly, is to be desirous for all people to experience God's goodness. God's goodness is not just for good people or Christian people, but that justice is that all people, being created in the image of God, We want them to experience God's goodness. To love mercy. This is in the Old Testament, the word is hesed, which means just covenant faithfulness, steadfast love. It's the consistency by which God operated toward the people of Israel. That God never turned away His love for the people of Israel. And so it was consistent, it was faithful, that God was always pursuing them. In the New Testament, we talk about this as grace. And so that we should love grace and be eager to display grace. I've been reading in Acts, and I think it's in the 11th chapter, they're first called Christians at Antioch. And one of the phrases that's used right before that, because this is the development of the church, is that they were first called Christians in Antioch by virtue of the evidence of grace. You see, as followers of Jesus in the body of Christ, what should be plastered all over the church and on the lives of Christians is the evidence of grace. We should love grace, and we do. We're so thankful that God has given us what we don't deserve. His grace, His love, His faithfulness. And then to walk humbly with God. This means to just keep in step with living as God's people. That we wouldn't be desirous to go and do our own thing or to do it our own way, but we're desirous to follow Jesus, to follow God and what He's called us to be and to become. You know, Micah, for me, the setting here, and really it leads up to this. He's brought charges really up to chapter 6. Now, chapter 6, this is a 7-chapter book, so everything has been leading up to this court case. And I wonder if God were bringing a case against us, what might He say? If God were taking us to court, if you will, what would be the accusations that He might make on our church or in our lives? And so it's a good reflection question. It's a good time to reflect on, if God were taking me to court, what would the accusations be that He would bring? That's just a good opportunity for us to reflect about who God is and what it means to be His person, what it means to be His church. And these are good things for us to be thinking about. So this week, be thinking or be processing or reflecting on what are the accusations. Now, let's change gears here just a little bit. And let's talk about Hosea. This is a great story. Just a phenomenal story. Rather than it being a court case, a story is told. And so here's how the story goes. That there's accusations brought in Micah. In Hosea, there's symbolism used. So God calls Hosea and He says, go and marry an adulterous woman. I don't know about you, but God, what are you asking? Hosea does it. They have 3 children. And each of the children has a specific name. I'd encourage you to go back and just read chapter 1. Each of the children are named. And it's symbolic of God speaking to the people of Israel. And He's forcing them to deal with their situation. That they are an adulterous people, just like Hosea's wife is an adulterous woman. So we get to the 3rd chapter. And what we have is a scene in which Hosea's wife, Gomer, has been, she's left Hosea. She's lived a wild lifestyle. She's loved by another. And apparently she's now in slavery because she's being sold. And the text insinuates, if you read it, it insinuates that she is unwanted at this point. That time has passed by, that she's not the beauty that she once was, that she's been most likely used and abused. However many years have passed. And God comes and He speaks to Hosea and He says, Hosea, go and bring Gomer home. And so he goes to where she's being sold and he buys her back. He says, I love you. Come be home with me again. And this is the image of how God responds to an adulterous people. How God responds to Israel. That even though they had gone and they had worshipped other gods, that they had been rebellious and disobedient, that God was using Hosea and Gomer as a visual, as a symbol of how God treats His people. Now God is not desirous for us to be an adulterous people or a rebellious people. But here's the reality. We are. And He comes to us and He says, I love you. I bought you with a price. I'm redeeming you back to myself, that you will come and live with me. As we continue this journey, we're going to discover just how intense God's love is for us. And the extent by which He will go in order to buy us back so that we can be home with Him. So, I leave you with this. Celebrate the love of God this week. It's a good thing to reflect on being taken to court, but it's equally a good thing to think about the depth of His love. So I'd encourage you to do both those things this week. God bless you. Have a great week.